Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring the idea of behavioural procurement. Now, if you've never heard that term before, and I've got to admit I hadn't before meeting with my guest on this episode, David Loseby, you might be wondering what procurement has to do with behaviour. And the answer is that behind every procurement and supply chain operation, there are human beings involved in the design and management of the processes. In other words, they're areas that present huge opportunities for human risk to manifest itself. As David, who specialises in helping companies to manage the behavioural dynamics between operational decisions, explains, there are trade-offs that need to be made. Just-in-time processes can deliver lower costs by reducing the need to warehouse stock and tie up working capital. But as we saw under COVID, they're also extremely vulnerable when things don't go according to plan. Perhaps when there's a pandemic or a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal. So what you're about to hear is how operational decision-making can easily go wrong if human factors are ignored, and also more positively, what we can do to mitigate the risk this poses. It's also worth remembering that if companies have a procurement function, it means the amount of money they're spending on procurement activities is large enough to justify the function's existence, which is great if they get things right, but not so good if they get things wrong. Before we begin the episode, I just wanted to let you know that by popular demand, I've recently launched a podcast newsletter, which will notify you whenever a new episode drops. You'll find a link to subscribe to that in the show notes and at the podcast website, humanriskpodcast.com. With all of that said, please enjoy, as I know you're going to because he's great company, my discussion with David Loseby on behavioural procurement. David, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you. So, over to you.
Why don't we start with you telling my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Wow, crikey. That could take the whole 60 minutes, but I'll endeavour not to do that. I guess I have quite a varied background and career. So, you could say that I've probably got three professional backgrounds, one of which is back to my days of construction and property, which is probably where my career first changed over in a little pharmaceutical company called GlaxoSmithKline. I moved over onto the dark side of procurement and supply chain towards the end of my sort of tenure there. I spent about 11, 12 years at GSK. Having done projects and programs, lived and worked in South America, some of the nice places, some of the not so nice places. Did the same again in sort of West Africa and Singapore, China, etc. So I had a good old romp around the world. Then decided that what I'd probably been doing for the last, I guess, 10 years or more was mainly change and transformation. So I set about that within a procurement and supply chain context. And probably for the last 20 years have spent time in lots of different organizations and sectors, both based in the UK, but also based globally as well, looking at setting up, upskilling, transforming procurement and supply chain functions in lots of different sectors, as I said, public sector, private sector, venture capital. And so pretty much nothing is off limits. But I guess in the process of all that, the one thing that I really, really recognized was that no matter how good systems and processes are, and I guess the light bulb moment for me was a board meeting at a company that I won't name, where I presented all the facts and data, and lo and behold, it was the completely opposite decision that I'd recommended. And I thought, there's something else going on here that I really don't understand. And so that started my behavioural science and applied cognitive science journey probably 15 years ago. And in the midst of that, two professors that I knew press ganged me one day and said, you should really do a PhD. So I did. And the rest is history, as they say. So that's my shaggy dog story to kick things off.
I love that light bulb moment where you go, whoa, that was not the script that was written. And I think that for me, that's really fascinating because it points to a kind of presumption that we have around, I think this is going to play out this way because I've seen things from my perspective, and I know there's a little bit of wishful thinking and a little bit of, well, obviously it's going to go this way. And then what you've neatly identified in one meeting is like that didn't go the way I'd planned. And so this idea, and I think this is fascinating in terms of the work that you do, because if we talk about things like sort of supply chains, that on the face of it, we use the word chain, right? So it sort of implies there's this nice sort of physical thing that is going to work in a predictable manner.
Correct.
And yet the world that we actually live in is one that's complicated, unpredictable, and challenging.
Totally. I mean, we are in the sort of I'll call it sort of the VUCA 2.0 world, I would guess you would probably call it, which is from the American Military College of, vulnerable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We seem to have sort of multiplied that by a factor of whatever. And I think the reality is that we are entering a period, in fact, probably now, I think going forward, a time where we can no longer say that actually we know what we're going to go do the next day, because we really don't. And so I think having this sort of ability to be completely agile, flexible, adaptable, all the things that we talked about in terms of survivorship are so true. And I think when you recognize that, yes, we have to do it within a framework and we have to develop certain skills and capabilities and competencies to do that, the one thing that we shouldn't expect is more of the same the day after, because that's clearly not what we're going to get. And I think that, you think about all the wonderful things like that's happening in terms of, people's cognitive load. We saw huge amounts of that during the pandemic period. We see all the sort of to use Dan Ariely's sort of book title, the predictably irrational stuff that we get to see. I just think we're just going to see more and more of that. And so to think that how can I put it? We're not going to get things that we didn't expect, I think is going to be incredibly naive going forward and misinformed, because I think it's absolutely going to be exactly that. Yes, there'll be some constants, but I think there's going to be way more variables than we've ever had before.
That's fascinating in the context of what you do, right? And your area of expertise, because in many respects, if I think about, a supply chain or procurement or any of these sorts of things, that is that requires a degree of predictability, right? We sort of assume I can just order some things, and we've all, it's almost. I was thinking the other day when you order something from Amazon in London, you can get same day delivery or worst case next day delivery of tons of different things, and then when it doesn't happen, there's like this. Oh, this is terrible. This is appalling, and of course that's a massive first world problem.
Oh, huge.
Just go back 5 years, and that would have seemed astonishing, let alone 10. So we have this view of, and I think a lot of people present 21st century structures as very efficient. They will work, but they're not necessarily particularly resilient in this context. So in many respects, a lot of the constructs that you've worked with are designed to provide certainty. In order for us to be able to do X, we need our suppliers to produce Y. So we fix all that up and then we're done. And of course, in an uncertain world, things don't always work out that way.
No, they don't. And I think what in fact, having conversations with a number of people over the last few weeks in terms of this whole sort of we can just turn the tap on and off as we will at our own whim. I think people are beginning to realize. I spoke to one person about sort of aerospace and defense, good example, whereby start of the pandemic, flying hours went down by 90%. Guess what? That had a bit of a knock-on effect. And so, engine production just ratcheted back down, right the way down to way below sort of normal levels by some country mile. But now you're in a situation whereby somebody's suddenly gone, yeah, no, but we need all these transport planes now. We need this, and we need defense stuff, and we need this and this and this. And literally, I heard a guy say, oh, yeah, we just upped the forecast by X amount of engines sort of thing. And the suppliers have all gone, yeah, you've got to be kidding, mate, because all the stuff that we had in terms of production lines, skills, capabilities, we can't just turn that back on again. So guess what? You're going to be really disappointed because we can't do that. And so I think what we're going to see is the sort of what we call in supply chain terms, the classic bullwhip effect, which is we've done something, but the ripple of that is not seen until some significant time further down the track. And this was very true in terms of lots of companies in all industries, all sectors, manufacturing, retail, etc., where people stopped doing stuff, they shut things down, they mothballed stuff. They had to release lots and lots of staff. Staff went into work in other areas. People did the whole reevaluation of what's life all about. Why am I working my socks off? But then, I'm just, I'm toast. I've got nothing left. And so therefore, what is life all about? So this whole reevaluation of what people's values systems are, what we really want out of life. I think that there's still quite a number of shakeouts to come that we haven't seen or predicted yet, because I don't think we can, because what we're saying by definition is we know how everybody behaves and thinks. Well, that's a naive concept in its own right. So, we're not going to do that, are we? Let's be honest. And so what comes next will be unpredictable, and we will have to deal with it.
And it is interesting because I think we often sort of think that, okay, I'm allowed to change my mind around things and be agile in my own head, but we kind of want everybody else not to do that. And so it's sort of, if I change my behavior, everything else is going to remain constant so that I can do that, so I have that flexibility. So we're used to, as consumers, being able to purchase certain things and just sort of changing them, do I want this? Do I want that? And I expect the choice to be there. And of course, what I think is interesting is in the physical world, you can't just as you say, you can't just turn taps on and off. So there's a sort of degree of, takes things longer to shift. And then the bit in the cognitive world, it's not just a case of, well, I'm going to behave in a particular way or trying to influence people in a particular way, and I can predict their outcome, because they will also be having thought processes of their own. And exactly. So people are reacting to the situation that's around them. And one of the things I think is really interesting is when we look at social trends and the way information and opinions kind of fluctuate. We're going through an interesting period at the moment where, there's lots of opportunity for people to express opinions and get different sources. And so this idea of humans as kind of a solid constant, we often think about people as being, he or she's very reliable. And then they do something that we weren't expecting. You go, whoa, what the hell? We have got a question. But of course, people are fluid and malleable and all those sorts of things. So I think there's this interesting, in all of these things that you've talked about, there's a desire for certainty, right? Because that's how our brains love that, because it makes life very simple. But that just doesn't exist.
No, it's a bit like saying, I want certainty with agility. So, okay, then help me understand how I get to that point, because it doesn't exist. And I think the fact that we think that we can oscillate that, that paradigm, if you like, in a sense, in a nanosecond and accommodate it is just fallacy. And so, there are going to be lots and lots of disappointments coming. That's the breaking news, as they say, because it's the harsh reality. And I think, both you and I know, all the 200 plus cognitive biases that we've got, all the heuristics, all the sort of the big five personality traits, all that kind of stuff. And you go, yeah, but if I attempted a calculation to multiply that all up on all the scales that are there, 1 to 5 and all the rest of it, you go, hang on a minute, I've just hit infinity, because that's the number of permutations that we're going to have to deal with. And so the reality is you can only ever sort of sit within that sort of channel, corridor, call it what you may, of, how can I put it, reasonably predictable behavior and outcomes. The outliers, the black swans, as Talib described it, which we've got way more of than we can do. We've probably got a flock of them now. We can't deal with that stuff. We're not geared up to do that, because you can't build a business on the basis of saying, I'm going to deal with all the black swans that come along. Well, you wouldn't be in business. You'd be bust, because you just simply couldn't accommodate that. It'd just be impossible. And so I think that, the more we see of these kind of sort of real, truly quite significant supply chain, value chain disruptions, I think that we'll recognize that actually it's the people that probably are the most agile and flexible, not necessarily the biggest or the strongest, that are actually going to come out the other side and actually do well out of this. But, if we go back sort of, I don't know, back to the Second World War, about sort of, the opportunities that people created out of the back of the Second World War, there were huge companies built on the back of that, but that was built out of a massive disruption. the whole debate now in the fashion industry. I was having a debate with one of the professors at the university this last week, and we were talking about, do the fashion guys disrupt themselves, or do they wait for the market to disrupt them, on the basis that saying fast fashion, which is, you buy a set of clothes and you dump it within a matter of 3 to 6 months and buy the next set. Not that you and I probably do that, but there are people that do that. You say, well, hang on a minute. If the customer base is saying, no, I don't want that anymore. I want to be able to have sustainability within fashion. Then it's a bit like saying, oh, hang on a minute. So what do the people do that have built this whole supply chain, this whole model predicated on everything's going to be sold and gone? We're just going to basically design and build and dispatch a batch of clothing, and then after that, we're not going to repeat it. That's it. So the whole model disrupts completely to no. We have repetitive stuff. So there's some real dilemmas out there in terms of businesses, in terms of, do they wait to be hit, or do they hit themselves first and know where the pain's going to come from and plan that sort of that disruption, or do they wait for the disruption? And it's quite an interesting debate, because it's not just a philosophical one. It's one that is actually probably going to hit. The question is when and how.
And of course, in the back of people's minds, there's always a possibility that this risk, right, this threat to your existing way of doing business may not crystallize.
Correct.
Now, as far as from my perspective, there is one-way traffic when it comes to things like the climate. I don't see us reverting back, but I'm also conscious that might just be my bias. It's perfectly possible that we retrench, and with the world becoming polarized, who knows where things might end up. And I'm the last person that should be trying to predict the future. But it is interesting that sort of desire for the past can hold us back sometimes. So the logical answer, if you were teaching a kid how to react to something, it's you fall off your bicycle, get back on it, right? Crack on. Don't let these things put you off. And so even if life is difficult, we teach them to kind of and yet as adults, we kind of go, well, maybe we can ride this one out. And I think when you're talking about fundamental shifts of businesses like fashion business, that's going to be really tough, because you've built a whole business model around a particular view of the world that you can sort of see is being undermined. Probably not even on a daily, at least on an hourly basis, you could find evidence for things not working out. And so that's quite tough when it comes to the sort of cognitive processes that we need to go through to deal with that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are instances when, I've got sort of teenage kids, and, they go, oh, I've seen this on TikTok, or whatever. And there's something that's the new biggest, flashiest thing, or whatever it happens to be. And it's sold out within an hour or 2 hours, or whatever it happens to be, because my daughter is, follows that kind of sort of fashion, if you like. And you go, yeah, but if they had a sustainable model and could actually produce more of that, then surely that's a major lost opportunity. In other words, you've squandered and completely underestimated the impact of what you've designed or whatever else. But on the flip side of that, of course, is it goes down a complete damp squib, and you're stuck with loads of stuff in a warehouse. So what do you do with that?
Right, and then the flip side argument is, of course, well, if it sells out, right, I create scarcity value. So the next thing I bring out, people are going to rush to buy. And so I've created a different kind of model. But all of this is a gamble on human behavior.
Yeah, of course it is.
Which I think is fine if you're a comedian putting together a set, and you can easily pivot to something else. Or you're producing software and you can tweak the thing very, very easily.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a massive supply chain behind it, that's not an instant decision that you can take that will suddenly solve that, because what's happening behind the scenes has lead times and complexity that doesn't lend itself to the sorts of dynamics that we're talking about.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you look at retail. I mean, they're busily and desperately trying to get their plans fixed, sorted, and designs complete for Christmas now. Now that's quite a sobering thought, really. But when you think about the gestation period of stuff going through that whole design, contracting, manufacturing, shipping, all that kind of stuff, you go, yeah, I'm not surprised actually, because there's a long chain to that. And I guess that's where it gets interesting, and that's why you can see that as people start to look at and I think what the current situation has done in terms of Brexits, pandemics, wars, etc., it gets you to sort of say, okay, I need to step back a pace and just not accept that things are going to be normal for some time to come. So maybe I need to rethink, do I really sort of, and one of the things that, just to sort of interrupt my own flow, is this whole pursuit of let's just pursue lowest cost, has actually left us to the situation whereby, lowest cost is not always the right answer. Or, as we experienced in the motor and manufacturing industry, just in time, hole in the wall type manufacturing operations, again, are they fit for purpose when you're living in a very, very different world? So they work for that period of time, but is it the right model going forward? And I think the answer is no, actually. But what I'm also not saying is you can't throw all of that away, because it still has its relevance and applicability. It's the extent and the degree to which it still works for the business model that you then recreate. And I think that's the fundamentals of it.
And the bit I find fascinating about that sort of, cost being the primary driver is, of course, that's easy, right? Because that sits on a spreadsheet, and I can put that, I can show people that that's there. Some of these other drivers are much less tangible and much more emotional and much harder to predict. And, we know what cost is. We don't necessarily know what the other things that might happen, or the reputational risk becomes quite difficult to quantify.
Yeah.
So as we look at that, that's perfectly logical and defensible, and it seems incredibly sensible. But as you say, other things can come along, and I think one of the challenges here is what are we trying to, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to be the lowest cost producer? Well, the risk with that is that someone comes along and is even lower cost. Yes. And so you're competing on a very obvious battleground. So what might be differentiating factors that are, go in a different direction, and how does one balance those two things out? And it's that classic trade-off. And I think what's really interesting is you point to, what you're illustrating here is a sort of manifestation in the real world of a problem that comes from the way we like to think about how to run businesses. So it's almost cognitive processes that have led us to conclude what in the case of supply chains, what the physical world needs to look like. But if those cognitive processes are flawed, in other words, the perspective that we have that got us there in the first place it might have been right at the time, but is no longer valid. We have a challenge. And so I see all of these things that become physical problems as starting with, put it very, very simply, people sitting around a boardroom table and making the wrong judgments about the world.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of examples I have in my world. I mean, and obviously, cost, and it's interesting. You use the word cost, but in procurement terms, particularly in the sort of I'll call it the more advanced procurement, we'll talk about value as opposed to cost, because cost in some ways is only one attribute, one dynamic. And it's interesting insofar as I once said to a CFO, I said, this contract has got the cheapest price in the world. And he said, fantastic. How much do we save? And I said, well, this is how much we save. I said, but what I will tell you is, I'll be very surprised if we can get it when we want it, and I doubt whether the quality will ever be good enough to sell. And he said, you're trying to mess me around. So I said, no, I'm not. I said, what I'm trying to illustrate to you is, it's not all about what's on your spreadsheets and what's the cost savings. I said, because they're artificial. They're only real when they've hit your P&L. This is before it hits your P&L. So what you need to get your head around is the fact that we can't just have a simple attribute of lowest cost as being our only differentiator. I said, is that what you want to be known for? And he said, well, no, that's not what the mission statement says and this and that. I said, no, exactly. So I said, if I go true to what the mission statement says, about customer service and I said, what you said to me is that this business is about service and quality, yet you're pushing me to find the lowest cost in the marketplace. So I said, on that basis, presumably you will buy your suit, I said, from Burton's. And he went, I'd never go in the place. So I said, exactly, because what you want is service and quality. And I said, if we've got a business around service and quality, you don't go to Aldi, Lidl, whatever, because that's not what you're telling me you want. So you have to decide. I said, you can't have all three. It's a bit like what we were saying earlier, which is about this whole challenge about certainty and agility. you can't have them. It's not possible. That they're contradictory. And so what you have to do is to say, where do I sort of plot in terms of lowest reasonable cost to deliver these service standards or these quality levels? And I said, that's a very, very different contract. So I can give you this contract. And I said, I'll tell you, we'll always get the product and it will always pass the quality inspections. But we'll only make, 4% savings rather than 10% savings. And that's the contract I'm going to recommend. But I need your support in the board meeting then to push this through. And he went, okay, I understand it now.
That's interesting, right? Because what I find fascinating is about those sorts of discussions in boardroom or business context, more loosely.
Yeah.
Is that we all understand that intuitively when we interact ourselves as individuals, right? So if I go somewhere and something seems ridiculously cheap, I'm suspicious.
Yeah.
So the restaurant that's offering me ludicrously cheap, I don't know, let's pick something, oysters or some, you'd sort of sit there and go, that doesn't, or steak, right? Here's an example, right? So you pick a very, very cheap steak. You go, well, the quality of the meat's not going to be very good. And so I will get a steak, but maybe I'll also get food poisoning. And where have they also cut corners? So there comes a time where you recognize and go, that's not, or if I pick, I don't know, you go to a market and you pick something up that's incredibly cheap.
Yeah.
You're going to think it's either stolen goods or it's a knockoff or something's not quite right. Even if I discount the fact that they're running a market stall, not a store, nonetheless, it doesn't quite feel right. And so we understand this sort of the concept of false economy.
Yeah.
We all understand it intuitively in our personal lives. And yet move to a business context and we kind of lose that human touch, that ability to question and go, this feels a bit weird. And so to your point around, let's pick an example of it. Retailer that you would understand, putting it on the high street, and I'll try and find. I don't think Burton exists anymore, but I'll put a link. I will put a link for overseas listeners so they can see the sort of store that we're talking about. It's pretty clear from your depiction. It catered for a certain price point
demographic,
and demographic, right? But it wasn't somewhere you'd go to buy long-term quality clothing.
No.
Or to get amazing customer service. But it's fascinating, isn't it, that we almost shut off some of those attributes. And I'm always struck by, if business were a little bit more human and we thought in more human terms, that would permit us to solve a lot of business problems in ways that might seem unorthodox in that context, but actually perfectly normal in quote unquote the real world.
Yeah, and I think when you think about this and you crank it back up again, you go, if you're talking to the CFO or whoever, and they're saying, yeah, this is all about maximizing profit sort of thing for the organization. But in some ways, that sort of, in a messy sort of way, blurs the vision in terms of, so how do we make sure then that we can deliver a profit next week, next month, next year? How do we build the next sort of set of products? I mean, I once went to one CFO that was, how can I put it? He really understood it, I think, way better than some of the others. And I said to him, I can do you a new energy deal. This new energy deal will save you 1.8 million. And this energy deal will save you 2.2 million. I said, however, on this other deal for 1.8 million, I can give you a customer database of 3.5 million names from this supplier who will make the introductions and help your sales team to drive new business. I'm going to recommend the 1.8 million. And he said, I totally agree. He said, because this is about driving value for this business, not just grabbing the lowest dollar. And it was quite interesting that he understood the concept of value and what the value that it brought to the business overall, as opposed to just ripping, if you like, in a sense, as much money as he could out the contract value. And so it's interesting when you start to have to sort of lay out those conversations. But this is where times this totally sort of, how can I put it? I call it sort of almost obscured rationality, which drives this sort of behavior that says, I want the cheapest cost, but even though I know I may not get it and the quality may not be right, and I probably won't get any innovation, and I won't get any customer service, and I won't get, and you just think, right, how do I turn that around? And I guess that's why I'm interested in the research area that I am, which is about then helping people then to create a new image, a new vision in their own minds to say, this is not the right choice. This is not the right choice for the business. And I'll tell you for why. And what you have to do is connect with examples, situations, things that they truly understand, but also recognise as well that, I mean, I said this to an MBA cohort yesterday, whereby I said, and don't think that just by presenting diagrams and talking to them is going to be good enough, because you'll have people in the audience who will want to see it written down and in tabulated tables. Don't expect that everybody will really like these colourful diagrams, because they don't. And I said, what I've realised is that through the years, I've had to recognise the different sort of, I'll call it neurological domains out of the 8 domains that we have neurologically, and say, how do I approach all the different characters in the decision-making process to guide this through where it needs to go, and what do I need to do? And that's around sort of understanding, but also applying some critical thinking to how am I going to make this decision work and not going to set me back 3 months when I've got to go back round the buoy all over again and lose time and lose value for the business that I'm representing. And so what I find interesting is that so many professions, not just procurement and supply chain, equip people for really effective understanding of systems and processes, but provide no training whatsoever, no development whatsoever in terms of human skills. And I find that fascinating. And when I analysed in the procurement and supply chain world, because I had to do this for my thesis, only one institute out of all the academic institutions and the professional institutions got close to just under 3% of their content in their syllabus touched on human and people skills as part and parcel of their degree level training, which was quite a sobering thought when I looked at it. In fact, in some cases, it was tending to zero. There was no recognition of it whatsoever. Didn't even feature.
Which is very logical.
Yes.
Right. You can see how you get there.
Totally logical. But if we lived in a totally binary, rational, how can I put it? It's all about the numbers. It's a bit like saying, well, actually, we'll talk in numbers then. We won't talk in speech. We won't use it. We won't use expressions. We'll forget all the expressions. We don't need to have humour. We don't need to have sadness and emotion and all that sort of thing. We'll cut all that out because it's actually getting in the way. We'll just have numbers, and we won't talk in, whatever language is native to us. We'll just simply use numbers because that's the rationality. And it's a bit like saying we live in that sort of, two-dimensional world rather than a multi-dimensional world. And I think it's sort of, it's those things in a sense that when you start to lay some of those things out, it prods people to start to go, oh, wait a minute, actually, maybe I do need to think about this a different way. But I do think you have to be slightly provocative in managing stakeholders and decision makers sometimes, but also a diplomat as well, because the last thing somebody who thinks they're really senior and it's their ink on the paper that's going to count probably doesn't want to be probably like you and I can have a conversation and take the mickey out of each other. They probably wouldn't appreciate that, and particularly not some guy that has got all these qualifications and they perceive you as being this sort of hyper intelligent, which I'm not, individual, and resent the fact. And so you've got all these things at play, and I just find it fascinating that you have to try and sort of navigate your way through this sort of myriad of channels and different. It's almost like a maze is the only way I can describe it. You're navigating through a maze, but the problem is if you ever get to a dead end or a stop or something like that, then that's it, game over. and that's the reality in business, which is if you end up in the dead end, it is game over. The lights get switched off and the door gets closed, and that's it. And you may not get another chance sometimes to present really critical and key decisions, contracts, whatever else. Somebody's already made up their mind that you've not delivered what their expectation about what the function was there to do, or what you're there to do as a senior leader in a business. and it can be quite sort of, it's quite a sort of how can I put it, high stakes game, as they say, in terms of doing that.
I think that's interesting because you sort of, what you're pointing towards is that there's a little bit of sort of stay in your lane, right? Which is where people, what are you doing? So I could look at you and say, well, okay, here's the supply chain procurement guy, right? To be sort of pejorative slightly. And why is he talking to me about these other things, right? You should just, I want you to give me the facts, make this thing happen, solve that problem for me, right? And we'll crack on. And to your point, it's like, actually, yes, the supply chain bit, the procurement piece, there's a whole load of other things that come with that. There's risks associated with it you might not recognize, there's dynamics, there's implications for the other bits of the business. So in many respects, to do your job properly, you need to have that broader conversation. And yet there is certain, we like neatly segmented worlds. And we don't, and I have this when I talk to people about, they'll come in and have a conversation about compliance. But actually, to have that conversation about compliance, I probably need to stray into some HR territory and talk about remuneration and your hiring process and your firing process and your disciplinary process. And there are obvious bits that people can say, okay, I see that sits in the compliance, but what the hell is he doing talking? And I get into health and safety, a load of other things, because I say, well, hold on a minute. To the average employee, the word compliance, yes, it means something in terms of a function, but actually, if we want to get a message across about what the organization's about, i.e. the broader cultural piece, there are going to be things that don't neatly sit in that compliance box that will have an impact on people's willingness and ability to comply, loosely defined, with the rules. So you'll think about it as keeping the regulator happy. I think about it as, well, we're into the realms of culture, incentives, much, much broader piece. And as you were talking about supply chains and procurement, there are just that simple example, let alone when you're stretching your tentacles into into other areas. These things don't present themselves nicely. And I always look at it as like when we go to school, we're presented the world in a very interesting way, which is, you go to a history lesson, you hear about history, and then you have geography, and then you have and physics, as if those things operated in isolation. Whereas they're actually, geography and history is an obvious example, right? There are reasons that a lot of things are driven. We can see that happening in the world in the moment.
Yeah.
And I think it's fascinating that, in a way, we like to try and simply segment stuff, and things are complicated. And so pretending that in business we've got certainty and clear delineations between these things, and we don't need to think across the delineations that are made in a business context, I think are similar to the way we're taught in school, right? Somebody segmented the world once upon a time and decided that we'd have a function that did X or a teacher that teaches Y, and we don't sort of think about the overlaps. Now, it's sensible on some level to think about that, because you do need the people thinking of those issues. But how do you get cross-functional collaboration? Well, you need to have people that are thinking in the terms you're talking about, i.e. the teacher that teaches outside the syllabus, that will think about how we link these things together.
Yeah, and I think this is where, for me, working as a professional across businesses, and of course, procurement and supply chain goes across pretty much the whole business, basically. And I've even used the phrase, I think, on one individual, where I said, you do realize we don't grow square oranges. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, what you have to realize is that in the real world, they're round, but they're not all perfectly round. And they're not all perfectly the same shape. This whole sort of notion that everything is exactly the same, it's not true. So what we have to do is to deal with and accommodate the messy reality of the real world. And so you start to help people sort of, and I think sometimes it's about sort of just jolting that sort of, it's almost like a disc that just spins round on the same axis at the same speed, but that's not reality, because we can't do that. And I think, this whole notion that real life has this wonderful uniformity and sort of harmony about it, is a myth. And I think it's about dealing with the harsh realities rather than the myths of life, and being able to say, within these boundaries, I can handle the situation, I can deliver it. But it's so interesting when you have the conversations, but as you will well know, straying into other areas and talking to, quality engineering about, something that you're just about to contract, In fact, I mean, you will know the Prudential Regulation Authority is about to go live in the UK, sort of thing. So, and I showed that to some other businesses who are in different sectors, and they're all going, really? And I said, yeah. And guess what? I think this is coming your way too. And it's like there's like this cold sweat that they break out into, which is not going to do that to us, are they? So I said, why not? And it's this like stony silence of, crikey, I've had the blinkers on and I just can't see the rest of the world. And of course, I guess that's the one thing that I've recognised is that I've said to some people that I probably know very little now about system and process because I have to understand about people and human behaviour way more, because that's the stuff that actually moves things and gets things done. And I said, for me to be able to, get the big decisions, move the roadblocks, keep the troops off and keep them in their respective sort of trenches and stuff like that, so you can get this done, is part of what I do as a senior leader in business. And understanding, the whole sort of, I'll call it specific rationality that pertains to each and every single business, individual, etc., because no two are the same. And like, I've designed all sorts of ESG programs and all sorts of other things. And I've said, each one needs to be tailored to each situation. Don't think that they're all going to be exactly the same, because they're not. The outputs might get to the sort of the same destiny, but it's a bit like a roadmap. You can choose lots and lots of different ways. You can take a car, a bus, a train, and there's lots of different routes you can take. So don't think that all has to be done exactly the same way. We can't do that. And that's in some ways how you create competitive advantage, because it's about how you deliver the end outcome. It's not necessarily in the details and the mechanics of how you get there.
I love this avoidance of cookie cutter mentality, right? Which is just sort of, we'll just roll the thing out. Like there is one answer, and that feels very super convenient. And I think that for me is fascinating, because there are lots of people, give me a framework and we'll just deploy that. We'll do what they've done, right? We'll take comfort from the rest of the tribe. What and best practice is the one that gets me every time, because I hate the phrase, because what does that mean, right? Who has decided this is best? And it's just like somebody's done something, everybody goes, oh, that's best industry best practice. Well, what does that mean? They have a completely different business model to you.
Correct.
Why don't you just blindly copy them? It's a little bit, it always reminds me of those things when you get hundreds of people there's a roadblock for some reason, and then loads of people just, they all seem to know something, so I'll just follow them. Right. And you end up kind of going completely where you didn't want to go, because they don't know anything either, but you presume that they do.
Yes.
And I think this idea of sort of, well, we'll just do what other people are doing and then we'll be okay is fascinating. So you get that. And then the flip side is the one you were talking about, which is kind of like, well, that's never going to happen here, because we're not idiots like that. We don't need. So if you take banking regulation as a good example, I agree with you that I think there are many dynamics that have kicked in banking, around, in simple terms, sort of social license, right? Yeah. Why do we allow people to engage in banking activities? Well, it's useful, it serves a purpose, but if you push that too far, you'll end up doing crazy things that we don't like, that don't. And so we should tightly constrain who is allowed to have a banking license. And I think they've started to really look at that and saying it's not a right to be able to do this, it's a privilege, and we need to treat it in that way. Well, I think you could say the same about utility companies, or anybody that has the people that are running businesses that pollute, or anything else that you might want to control from a societal perspective. So you're right. The logic that's applied there, which says the reason we regulate you is because you're doing something that's somehow systemically important to society. And so we're going to start looking at that, not just in terms of how much you charge for your product, but also the way that you go about doing it. And we don't want you to do crazy things and take big risks, because that has a consequence. And so I love this idea that simultaneously we are kind of copying what other people do, right? Best practice type logic. And consultants don't help this, right? Because they troll out the same models elsewhere. And you sort of take, well, if it's good enough for Apple, we'll be doing the same thing. Well, why? Right? Because it might not be any good. But you got the flip side, which is, I see that company that is sort of similar to ours. They had a blow up, but that wouldn't happen here, right? Because we're better than that. And I love this piece, but all of that's important because it all plays into how we react to what other people are doing. In other words, if we didn't know what was happening in other companies, we would probably end up in some respects better off, because we wouldn't be copying stupid ideas and just assuming that because they're doing it's a good idea. And maybe we'd be avoiding sort of willful blindness on certain topics. But we'd also miss the opportunity to learn. And I'm fascinated by this idea of sort of how do we use that lens of other people's behavior influences us, either because we ignore it and we think they're idiots, or because we copy it because we think they're geniuses. And the criteria that we use to select those is, of course, a bit random. But I find that fascinating because I think that drives a lot of business behavior that's not necessarily healthy.
No, absolutely true. I mean, it's quite interesting. I'm smiling there because it reminds me of a situation a number of years ago where, we were about to start some big sort of, major transformation, big new system coming into the company, multiple entities, all that kind of stuff. And the change consultants turned up and they literally pulled out all the change decks that they'd used in the last, couple of projects or programs and went, right, we just need to change the name on the top. And, and I'm thinking, give me strength. Like, this is just like, this is just a recipe for disaster. I'm just going to stand back and just watch the explosion because that's exactly what's going to happen here. And this sort of, interesting debate, with some of the change consultants, in inverted commas, around, trying to get them to sort of say, you need to understand, and I use the COM-B model and other methodologies and stuff like that in terms of, the whole sort of, what are the motivators, what capability am I dealing with, where are the opportunities, all that sort of stuff. And trying to get these guys to sort of, and girls to sort of think differently was quite interesting because it was almost like we just do the same as we did the last time out. And it's a bit like sort of, I use the analogy around sailing, which is if you chart exactly the same course and do exactly the same things, you're going to hit the harbour wall because last time there was a force 10. Right. So it's the definition of stupidity, which is doing exactly the same thing in a different setting and circumstance. It's tantamount to sort of how can I put it? Just simply waiting for the crash, really, because it's just not a question of if, it's when, and how big is it going to be? How big's the pile-up going to be? The problem is with those sorts of things, though, that you find is that then, as I've said to people, you're not then starting from the 0 coordinates. You're starting from a negative number because you've already done some inherent damage in the business. So you've lost trust, you've lost confidence in the capability and the ability of that particular group or individuals or whatever to be able to add value to the organization. And fundamentally, you haven't listened or understood what their business is about. And of course, as well as I do, that it's that classic, don't start making big decisions and moves before you truly understood exactly what you're dealing with, And if you said to somebody, I tell you what, there's this live bomb sitting in the boardroom and you've got to go in and diffuse it. Are you happy just simply following the manual on the last one you did? And I bet you most people would go, no, I think I want to understand what I'm dealing with, because if I'm going to be sitting on the top of this thing, it may not be a good idea because there's a good chance it will go off. Well, that's exactly the same in terms of thinking that, to your point about best practice and just simply by rote tripping out the same thing that happened last time without really truly understanding the context, the situation, and the people that you're dealing with is just a recipe for disaster. And it's a sort of a naive thinking. It's back to the rationality again, which is everybody performs, behaves, and interprets and makes decisions around the world exactly the same. Well, guess what? We're not robots. We're individuals, and so this whole sort of fallacy around the whole best practice and just using the same process, but without thinking about. So actually, does all of this apply? I mean, I remember going into one organisation where, we have what's called a category management process for doing procurement. A very robust process, 5 stages, lots of different things within each of the stages, and gate reviews and all sorts of stuff like that. And I went through it and I said, well, that doesn't apply and that doesn't apply. We don't need to do that. We need to do more of that, less of this. And they went, no, you've got to follow the process. You've got to do all the boxes. So I said, no, we're not going to do that. Oh, the senior vice president's not going to like that. So I said, well, he's just going to have to get upset then, because I said either he gets upset, I said, or all my stakeholders and budget holders get upset, and I'll tell you which ones I prefer to upset, and that's the guy sitting over there who's designed the process, because he doesn't understand the organisation. And it was quite interesting. And it was probably slightly Machiavellian of me, because I then pulled in what was then the chairman of the global operations division, who I knew personally, actually, but he didn't know this. This guy had taken over the senior vice president role. And I played out a number of scenarios in terms of how we're going to interact with the business, and, what were the ways of working going to be, and, how we were going to communicate and all that sort of thing. And I played out all of these things in this meeting. And of course, I got complete and utter backup from the chairman, which completely buried this other guy, which he didn't like. But nevertheless, it meant then that we could then approach this area of the business that had not been really properly serviced or how can I put it, engaged fully, or in fact, they hadn't engaged at all with procurement and supply chain in the past. Suddenly we went from doing nothing to we had more demand than we knew what to do with. And I think that for me, in a sense, is the testament to the fact that you just simply can't follow blindly a process. You have to understand all the dynamic things that are happening around it, because we're not living in a static world, and even more so today.
And I find that interesting because I think there are contexts in which you absolutely should just slavishly follow the rules. So if I look at the physical world, it's physical safety.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right? Is that's not changing at all. What you do with a nuclear reactor, right? I don't want someone going, I'll miss step 6 and just press the button without activating the safety thing, right? Not good. And so there are contexts in which, there is no question, right? Just slavishly follow. I don't want people in a restaurant going, I didn't like the food safety standards, so I made my own up that involved not washing my hands after coming from the toilet. It's just that sort of situation. But that's predictable, controllable, because the laws of physics don't change. And what I think is interesting is we take that same logic, which is, here's a framework. I'm going to just slavishly follow the framework. Well, why? What are the presumptions behind that framework? And just because someone else in another organization thought it was a good idea, doesn't mean it was a good idea in their organization. Doesn't mean it's a good idea in your organization. And it's perfectly okay. If you look at something and go, this makes no sense whatsoever, a little bit like if I'm in traffic, sorry, I should say, if I am part of the traffic, right, causing the road, and there's an ambulance trying to get through, I will break rules of the road, right, to let the ambulance through. I might go through a red light slightly in order to make sure the ambulance can get through. That's me overriding standard procedure and taking a little bit of a risk because I'm technically breaking the law, but that feels like the right thing to do. And I think that's for me is the fascinating example. Well, Want an Easy Life, we'll just roll out this thing. And as you say, if the thing is being advised to you by someone that's external who knows by default knows less about your company than you do, that's a terrible thing. The value they add is maybe teaching you about ideas that they've come across elsewhere that you can borrow from, but then you adapt them for your environment. Absolutely.
I mean, the operative word for me there is about adapting other things. I mean, I'd probably, like you in a sense, have looked at different things from different industries and different ways of doing things, but it's the make sense and translate that's the important bit. It's a bit like going in and saying, right, now talk to these people in this room. Okay, so you go in as a native English speaker and they're all Chinese. Well, that's not going to help then, is it? Because they won't understand me. What's the point in doing that? I've followed the rules. I've told them all about this process. Yeah, but they don't understand any of it because they don't speak your language. What's the point? So it's the whole sort of context, the whole make sense and translate. I mean, I've taken lots of things from different sectors all through my career in terms of, adapting and changing and ensuring that it aligns and fits with, the sector, the company, the culture, the people, the decision makers. There's all those dynamic sort of attributes, in a sense, that I have to take account of and should take account of to ensure that it's successful. but naively and blindly going in there, this worked in the last place, and to use your words, it's best practice, so go fill your boots with that. It's just blind naivety. And actually, in some ways, I would actually say anybody who does that doesn't understand what they're trying to do. They don't have the skills and capability to be doing what they're doing, because they don't understand what the whole essence and purpose of the approach is. And so,
I mean, it's literally like copying someone else's homework at school. Not that you or I would ever have done that, right? But you're not learning.
Of course not. You know me too well. No, it is. It is that classic sort of. In fact, I actually did that once and got caught out. So that does remind me of a good occasion when I was doing my A-level chemistry, and I hated organic chemistry, and so I blindly copied this guy's homework, and then I was the first person to be asked the question about why such was the route to this calculation, and I was completely caught out of my depth. And rightly so, because I didn't understand the principles and the process to what I was doing. The same is true in business, blindly sort of just putting it out there without understanding, what it is that you're doing. You have absolutely no idea whatsoever the consequence or the chaos you're going to cause.
Right. But it's sort of, it feels safe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course it does. It feels like it worked before. So this is maybe the blind logic. It worked before, therefore it must work again. It's a bit like the analogy you used earlier, which is, there's a traffic jam, so everybody diverts off and goes down the country lanes and follows the first person that starts weaving their way through the country lanes, only to find that they've ended up in some farmyard that's a sort of everybody's got to reverse back through the cow sheds and back out again. You just think, what was that all about? Why did they just blindly follow? And that's exactly the same as just saying, I did it over here and it all worked. I'll just blindly do it all over again.
Actually, I've just thought of a more amusing example of that. When there was the fuel strike here, like last year, and so it wasn't fuel strike; it was panic buying of petrol, wasn't it? There was, for some reason, right? There was a guy who was. I read this great stuff. I'll put the link to this in the show notes. There was a guy who was driving a tanker, which contained, I think, some sort of chemicals, right? So nothing to do with fuel at all. But these people spotted him and decided, so he's driving around the countryside and he's got like a queue of 20 or 30 cars. And of course, the more people that have joined this thing, the bigger the line becomes. So he's literally driving around and he pulls over and goes, what are you following me for? They go, I'm following you to the next petrol station.
It's got fertilizer probably in the back.
It was something like that, yeah. And he was just like, what are these idiots doing? But you can kind of see the logic.
Of course you can. Absolutely.
That gets you there. But
because you think somebody's got first mover advantage, has, worked out, this is the nirvana to sort of solving the problem. And of course, we see lots of that. And I think, it's sort of got shades of groupthink about it, which is as you go through and more people get convinced that actually, this is the direction to go, nobody's going to challenge it. They will just blindly follow, because, there's one guy who's decided that that's the right tanker, and you follow it. And of course, it's not that at all. And it's this sort of the king's new clothes, isn't it? Hang on a minute, he's not wearing any clothes. He might be the king, but he's in the nude. And that's exactly what you get. So I think it's same is true in business. Which is, I suppose, it's having that ability then to call that out in a way that then doesn't become confrontational, because nobody likes being made an example of, fool of, call it what you may, but senior people in business and in fact other individuals. And to be fair, I wouldn't want somebody to do that to me either. So you have to find a way of actually saying, hang on a minute, can we just, step back through this again? Because I want to be sure that we're going in the right direction. Without sort of completely, embarrassing and sort of throwing somebody off track or under the bus, as they say. You can't do that. So you have to find ways of doing that in a way that is, I'll call it respectful, particularly of senior decision makers, because the chances are you're going to have to go back to them at some point later and say, can you sign off on this decision?
Corrective measure.
Yeah, right. and you want,
You wouldn't call it that, but that's sort of what it is.
and so therefore you want their buy-in. You don't want them to go, oh, it's you again, is it?
Reflecting on the physical infrastructure piece that we've talked about, so the expensive bits, if you like, of procurement, supply chains, the sort of stuff. One of the challenges I see is that, I talked about examples of things where you can pivot very quickly. The comedian who can ditch a joke or tweak one, the software engineer who can tweak the software. When you've got those sorts of things with lead times and physical info, and I'm sort of thinking of my ships going through the Suez Canal, ideally not stopping halfway, that's quite hard to sort of remain flexible around, right? How do you introduce that? How does one think about those things? So in a sort of harsh physical world that doesn't lend itself to changing rapidly, how does one bring in some of these ideas? Because inevitably in business, you're going to have to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And so I'm intrigued. How does one deal with that dynamic that says, actually, it's one thing me deciding I've got the color of my logo wrong, right? And I can quickly get that changed. Okay, I'll have to do some PR around it maybe, or I can just stealth it out. But that's fundamentally different to, we have locked ourselves into this massive supply chain for a period of time. How does one maintain that agility, flexibility, and permit mistakes to happen in that environment, which are going to happen?
Well, I think the honest answer to that is that's probably the reason why you've seen some of the empty shelves in supermarkets and things like that, because people can't pivot that quickly and can't get themselves out of specific contracts or supply chain routes or whatever else. And I think what this has done is, and particularly because the last few years supply chain and procurement have been brought into very clear and crystal focus. I think it's allowed those that are able to apply good critical thinking skills to the problem have said, we need to de-risk this. We need to provide more resiliency within our supply chain. So I've seen some CPOs have gone, chief procurement officers, that is, right, okay, so it's all about cost. So they've created monopoly supply situations as a consequence of trying to sort of do what they think is the right thing, which is about taking costs out of the organization because they're under cost pressure, but then inherently then ratcheting up significantly then the risk profile of the business. On the flip side of that, some of the more lucid and more, how can I put it, expansive thinkers have said, we need to de-risk this. So staging supply chains. So for instance, if you've got certain componentry or whatever else, you can bring certain things unassembled into much closer geographies to where your manufacturing base is, as an example, such that it's only 1 or 2 days away by road, rail, or whatever freight you choose to use, but it's not fully assembled. So therefore, what you're trying to do then is to say, I can't bring in all the finished goods, but what I can do is I can stage it so that I've got part of the assembly sat, very close to my doorstep, so I can still deliver the customer service that I need to deliver. I can still deliver the product when I need to deliver it. But actually, I realise that I've introduced a small amount of cost in order to do that. But what I have done is I've de-risked a very risky supply chain. So there are various measures and things that you can do, as well as, people have talked very much about greater diversification within supply chains. In other words, not fewer suppliers, but more suppliers, but all accredited and tested to the same quality and service standards, etc. So that way then, if one supplier or supply chain is impacted for whatever reason, it's much easier to ask for another 5 or 10% from several other supply chains. But I ask one supply chain to double their output at the drop of a hat, it's not going to happen. So creating this resiliency within the supply chain, people have realised that there is a benefit to doing that, and actually, given the I'll call it the amount of distress that there is in logistics and supply chain at the moment, then people are thinking, actually, back to the original, I can't have lowest cost, highest quality, and the most impressive service. They don't all go together, unfortunately. So I have to make some choices. And this is about then rebalancing that equation, so that way then people can begin to sort of say, right, I can deliver what I need to do. But what it will mean is that because I'm there for the customer. I can deliver when they want it, whereas others may be impacted by supply issues, quality issues, whatever else. That will ensure then that I have a business that will come through into the next sort of period and not be at risk of losing the business. So I think that there are various ways in which people have adjusted this, but what you'll find is in highly regulated industries, it may take 2 or 3 years to completely redesign a supply chain and put new contracts in place and new routes, etc. These are not things that you can just, let's say change like a light bulb overnight. It doesn't work like that. These are quite complex beasts to deal with.
And of course, if you could, right, that's there's a competitive threat.
Oh yeah,
right, because nobody else can step in. So to a certain extent, you need this.
Yes, it's a barrier to entry into businesses. Which is why you've in certain industries you've only got a few providers. So you take certain areas of nuclear, vaccines, medical, aerospace and defense, etc. All those highly regulated industries, there aren't masses and masses of providers and suppliers, etc., because the barrier to entry is so high, because the complexity of deconstructing and then reconstructing supply chains for those types of organizations is a significantly onerous task.
Amazing. I could keep talking, but conscious you have clients to look after and other interesting things to delve in. So before we close out, David, if people are intrigued by what you said, and I know they will be, how can they get hold of you?
LinkedIn is always a great place to catch hold of me. I will just do a quick plug and say I do have a book on the shelves, Soft Skills for Hard Business, which is predominantly aimed at sort of procurement supply chain, but it is truly applicable to other disciplines too. So that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much for bringing a real sense of humor to what you do. It's nice human touch in a world that I think many of us think of as sort of hard and physical. And as the book title implies, I think you bridge that gap beautifully. And thank you for being an amazing guest on the podcast.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to David for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about David, his book, and the work that he does, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. A quick reminder that if you want to subscribe to the Human Risk Podcast newsletter, which will notify you whenever a new episode drops, have a look in the show notes or go to humanriskpodcast.com and sign up there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. Do sign up for the newsletter if you are interested at humanriskpodcast.com. But in the meantime, stay safe, keep your procurement behavioural, and thanks for listening.